Welcome to week 4 of Fundamentals of Biblical Interpretation. Last week we finished Dennis Edwards' book, and this week we will be starting Ben Witherington III's book called Reading and Understanding the Bible. This one will take us, I think it's about 6 weeks to get through. You can look it up on the syllabus and that will tell you. For this week, you will be reading the invitation and chapters 1 through 3. You'll notice that the language of this book is a little more difficult than the language that Dennis Edwards used in his book. But like the previous book, this book also has a glossary, and any word that's in the glossary is bolded in the text. So if while you're reading you come across a word in bold that you're not quite sure what it means, you can look in the back on page 253 and look it up in the glossary. Because this book is a little more difficult, I'm not going to put quite as many questions in the discussion board. That should give you extra time to spend on the reading, rereading paragraphs that maybe aren't clear. And I've also added an ungraded thread on the discussion board. And it's just a place for open discussions. Like I said, there won't be any grade attached to it. But if something comes up in the reading that you have questions about, that you weren't sure you understood, that you want to discuss with other students that isn't mentioned in the questions that I came up with, or questions that you want to ask me about the text, or concerns that you have about the text, the open discussion thread is there for that. When you read the invitation and chapter 1 in this book, it will be a bit of a review from what we saw in Dr. Edwards' book. It will review things like what the Bible is and where it came from. Chapter 1 also discusses, if you're brand new to the Bible, where you should start. Some people start at Genesis and try to read all the way through the Bible. Many people get stuck in maybe Leviticus or maybe Numbers. Other people say start in the New Testament, start with the Gospel of Matthew and move through. Others suggest starting with the Gospel of Mark or the Gospel of John as good starting places to read the Bible. Dr. Witherington has a different suggestion, and I'll let you find that on your own. And we'll be discussing this week what you think of Dr. Witherington's suggestion and how you might help someone else to start where he suggests starting in the Bible. And I'd love to hear about your experiences reading the Bible for the first time. Chapter 2 gives the overall story of the Bible and focuses specifically on the stories, the narratives that are told in the Bible. And I wanted to mention Gordon Fee and Douglas Stewart's book, How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth. There they suggest that when we read the stories in the Bible, we can ask 3 questions. One good question to learn is, what did I learn about God? And what did I learn about human beings? And what did I learn about the relationship between God and human beings from this story, from this passage in the Bible? A second question, though, that's important to think about is, how does this story fit into the larger story of God's relationship with God's people? In the Western world, we have a tendency to think of the Bible as written specifically to me. And outside of the stories in the Bible, we might be tempted to think that when the Bible uses the word you, that the Bible means me, the reader. Most often, though, when the Bible says you, the Bible basically means y'all, all of you, the whole group of you. And for those of us who live and maybe were raised in a Western individualistic culture, we need to be challenged, and we ought to challenge ourselves to think about what this story or what this passage means for the body, for the people of God broadly speaking, specifically the people of Israel in the Old Testament and the broader community of the people of God in the New. The third question, though, to ask is, how does this story fit into the larger story of God's relationship with the whole world? Over and over in the Old Testament, God keeps telling Israel that he wants them to behave in these ways. He wants them to do specific things so that the nations will know that he is God. And so we see from the very beginning God's care and concern for the whole world. And so the third question that we can ask about any story that we read in the Bible is, what does this tell us about God's relationship with the people of the world? I think the overall story, I think knowing the overall story that Dr. Witherington gives us in chapter 2 can help us to answer those questions. Now, chapter 3 suggests that there are differences between the ways that people write today and the ways that people wrote then, and that knowing about those differences is really important to helping us understand the Bible. Dr. Witherington mentions 5 differences specifically. He points out that in the ancient world, when they told stories, what was most important was to tell the stories that revealed the main character's character. What kind of character does this person have? What does this person's behavior tell us about this person's character? So those are the questions we should be asking when we read stories as well. The second thing that Dr. Witherington mentions is how expensive writing was. It was expensive to hire a scribe if you couldn't write. It was expensive to buy writing tools. It was expensive to get a hold of something to write on. And so it was important to be brief. If something is included in the story, we can know that it was important to the person writing it. The third and fourth things that Dr. Witherington mentions have to do with the fact that there were no psychologists and there was no psychiatry in the ancient world. So some of the questions that our culture teaches us to ask were not in the minds of the early writers or readers. So, for example, when we read about somebody's behavior as an adult, one of the first questions we might wonder is, what happened in this person's childhood? How did the childhood of this person form him or her into the adult that they are today? But in the ancient world, they didn't ask those questions. Childhood was not seen as important. And so while we might have those questions, the biblical writers are not going to be addressing those because that's not the way they thought about life. The second thing that we often think about is psychological motivation. Why is this person doing this? What are they thinking? What is motivating him or her in his or her behavior? But in the ancient world, they didn't use psychoanalysis. They simply knew that actions reveal character. And so the actions of people are portrayed in order to reveal the character of that person. Finally, in the ancient world, group identity was more important than individual identity. When I raised my kids, it didn't occur to me to say to them ever, don't do that, don't behave in those ways, because we are hunts, and hunts don't behave in that way. Or we are Americans, and Americans don't behave in that way. But all over the world and throughout history, and even in the US, there are areas, there are cultures where group identity is very important. And they raise children to behave in certain ways because everybody in the group is expected to conform their behavior according to group identity. And so recognizing that, and we'll talk about this in future weeks, as we approach the Bible, is really important. Most of the ancient cultures that the Bible was written to and from placed a great emphasis on groups and group identities. Now, Dr. Witherington is a prolific writer. I will give you a link to at least one of the videos he's made. If you like his style of writing as we're reading through this book, you might want to look up some of the other things he's written and get on YouTube and do searches for Dr. Witherington and see the many videos he's made on all sorts of different topics. Have a good week. You have 4 questions on the discussion board, and like I said, I also have an open discussion thread that's not graded, where you can have further discussions about the text if you're interested. Take care. Bye-bye.